One of the very first phrases I learned in German when I moved to Germany was "Wie viel kostet es?" How many of you German speakers know what I'm saying? Oh, maybe my German's not as good as yours. It means, what does it cost? How much does it cost? And this was a really important phrase for me to learn, because when I went to the market to buy food every day, I had so much cash in my hand. And when that cash was gone, there was no credit card or checkbook. That's all we bought. And so how much it cost kind of determined what we ate. It was a really important phrase. And I have to confess that I am not a shopper. I don't enjoy browsing through stores and looking at rows and rows of merchandise with that idea in mind that I'll know it when I see it. It doesn't get it for me. Because when I do that, I invariably run across the one item that I really think I want, that I really like, and then I look at the price tag and I know it's way out of my budget. Or even worse, there is no price tag. And you know that old saying, if you have to ask how much it is, you can't afford it. And I know I probably can't afford it. Well, today, Jesus is explaining the true cost of discipleship, of following him. And he is on the move again. You know, he had dinner at the Pharisees' house, but now he's back on the road heading toward Jerusalem. And he knows this is his last trip to Jerusalem, even if his disciples aren't aware of that fact quite yet. He knows that this is a costly trip. He knows what it's going to cost for him, but his disciples don't yet know what their cost is going to be. Hear the word of the Lord from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, verses 25 through 33. Now, large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost, to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You know, it almost sounds as if Jesus is trying to get people to stop following him, doesn't it? Have you ever heard him be so negative? 10 times in these few verses, he uses the word "not." And 3 of those, it's to tell us we cannot be his disciple unless we do the things he says. Now, Jesus has seen the crowds growing behind him, and he knows that some of these followers are only tagging along because they hope for a free lunch. They remember that story, or they were there when he fed so many people on the hillside. Some are just following because they've tagged into that mob mentality that is starting to surround Jesus. And we will see when he gets to Jerusalem that those mobs can be very friendly, and they can also be not so friendly. So he turns to the crowd and he says, "Unless you're serious about following me, you might as well go home." But Jesus isn't really trying to get rid of followers. He just wants them and us to know what is involved in being a true disciple. We need to know what we're getting into when we say we want to follow Jesus, because the cost is high. Jesus says we must hate our families if we want to follow him. Now, this was pretty strong stuff in a culture where family was everything, and loyalty to one's family was the highest loyalty expected. So let's take a look at that word hate and see what Jesus means. First, we have to realize that this kind of hate is not an emotion. It's an attitude of perspective. First century Greek had really very few words in it, fewer than 7,000 total words. A single word then had to have different meanings. It got used in different ways. And the Greek word miseo can be translated as hate, but it also means disregard, be indifferent to, or comparatively love something less than you love something else. So Jesus is offering a comparison between the devotion one would normally show only to family members and the devotion that is required to become one of his disciples. Jesus is saying, as important as your family is to you, as much as you love them, you have to love me even more. Love me more than whatever holds first place in your life, whatever matters most to you. Not only must we be willing to put Jesus ahead of all other priorities in our lives, he raises the price of discipleship even higher. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Now keep in mind that at this point in his ministry, his own cross wasn't even on the horizon yet. We might immediately think of Calvary when we hear him say this, but his disciples weren't thinking about that. For them, to carry one's cross meant to be willing to go to all extents. It meant to be willing to face death. It was what a soldier was willing to do when he went into battle, willing to die for the cause. To them, taking up one's cross was simply a general expression of accepting great suffering, suffering that could end in death. Jesus must have seen the faces around him that had been so joyful a moment before start to turn somber as they realized what he was saying. Whenever Jesus found that his words were too hard for people to hear, he would often resort to his favorite teaching technique, a parable. And here he uses two short ones that we need to listen closely to. He says, if you were going to build a tower, wouldn't you first sit down and figure out if you could afford it? You wouldn't want to become a laughing stock because you failed to plan your project well. And if you were a king going into battle, wouldn't you first sit down and figure out if your army was strong enough to defeat the enemy? But there are three things about these two little parables that we need to pay attention to, and we might miss if we read through them too quickly. First, Jesus tells us that the process of building or going into battle starts with sitting down. Did you notice this morning that your call to worship was sitting down? That some of our songs have been more contemplative, focusing us on the pondering we need to do to follow Jesus? Counting the cost requires some thoughtful pondering before any action can take place. In the same way, we can't follow Jesus any old way it suits us. We have to carefully consider the commitment we are making. And the second thing about these two little parables is that Jesus focuses on the outcome. Counting the cost indicates that there is some end in mind, some goal to be reached. You don't start building a tower unless you plan to finish it. You don't head into battle unless you think you can overcome the enemy. You don't follow Jesus unless you want your life to be changed. Finally, Jesus indicates that the cost is always too high. it costs more than our resources can come up with. No matter what accounting system you use, no matter what assets you think you have, when it comes to following Jesus, you don't have enough to pay the cost on your own. Your resources are not sufficient. There's no price tag visible, so you probably can't afford it. But Jesus isn't finished. So therefore, he says, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. Not only do we need to count the cost is everything we hold valuable. We have to bid farewell to everything we call our own. We have to leave behind everything that matters most to us. And when Jesus says you have to leave behind everything that matters to you, whether it's family or your good standing in the community or the things that you own, he means you have to leave it behind now, and you have to keep leaving it behind. This isn't, oh, do it once and you're done and you can go back to your old ways kind of thing. It's an ongoing, day by day, moment by moment surrender to God's grace and mercy. To be a disciple of Jesus, you must know that the cost will be putting Jesus first and everything else last. It starts the moment you say yes to Jesus, and it doesn't end, ever. There is no 401k plan for being a Christian. You don't retire from following Jesus and then live off the investment of your past discipleship for the rest of your life. It doesn't work that way. Every day starts anew. Every moment requires your full commitment. And if you aren't willing to give your all, Jesus says, you cannot call yourself one of his followers. You know, all those lessons that Jesus has been teaching us over the last few weeks as we've walked through these chapters of Luke, the lessons about hypocrisy, about letting our fear get the best of us, about placing a higher value on material wealth than spiritual wealth, it all boils down to this: go all in or go home. We can't hold anything back if we want to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Because there is no way to just sort of take up your cross. There's no way to follow Jesus on your terms when it's convenient to you. You can't follow Jesus because of the way it makes you feel good or the way others admire you and the good things you do. You have to surrender everything to Christ, or you aren't really a follower. The cost is high. But the cost of not following Jesus is even higher. Yes, Jesus asks us to leave everything else behind, to make him our first priority. But what price do we pay if we do not follow Jesus? What's the cost of refusing to be a true disciple? In his book, Spirit of the Disciplines, Dallas Willard lists the things that we sacrifice if we don't follow Jesus with our whole being. He says, non-discipleship costs abiding peace, a life penetrated throughout by love, faith that sees everything in the light of God's overriding governance of good, hopefulness that stands firm in the most discouraging circumstances, power to do what is right and withstand the forces of evil. In short, it costs exactly the abundance of life that Jesus said he came to bring. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: is it worth it? Is it worth giving up abiding peace to live life on our own terms? Is it worth sacrificing a life penetrated by love for the sake of having things the way you like to have them? Is it worth cutting yourself off from a faith that trusts in God's overreaching plan for your good in order to run your life the way you want to? Is it worth giving up hope and the power to stand in the face of evil? Is it worth it to you to say no to God's abundance so that you can skimp by on your own meager resources? Because that's what it costs to not take up your cross. Now, notice that I am not talking about salvation here. I'm talking about discipleship. I grew up in a church that focused all of its attention on getting people saved, but it failed to teach those new believers how to follow Jesus and make him Lord of their lives once they had experienced that salvation. Jesus wants to do more for us than save us from our sins, as important as that is. Jesus wants to give us abundant life, to deepen our relationship with him as we grow in faith. Jesus wants us to be his true disciples. So when we say yes to following Jesus, when we surrender our will to his will, something amazing happens. Bit by bit, we are changed. Each time we keep saying, "Yes, Lord, I leave behind everything to follow you," we are reformed, we are transformed, becoming more and more like Christ. We experience abundant life by God's grace. And we discover that the cost of following Jesus that we thought we possibly could not afford is worth it all, because the price has already been paid out of God's deep love for us. And when we give our all to Christ, we receive so much more. As we come to this table, prepared for all who desire to follow Jesus, he invites you to count the cost. Don't come out of habit or because you want others to see you doing the right thing. Don't come to prove yourself righteous, because none of us is righteous on our own. When you come to this table, come to offer yourself, body, mind, and soul, to the one who died to save you, who rose again to redeem you, and who will come again to claim you as his own. When you come to this table, having counted the cost, come as a true follower of Jesus Christ, ready to leave behind everything you ever thought was important, so that you can take up your cross and follow him. Amen.